In recent years, a shift in regional precipitation has led to a gradual but steady decrease in water levels in the Euphrates River, which threatens to leave the river completely dry in as little as a decade if the trend continues. This has led some biblical literalists to conclude that we are living in the end times. This view stems from passages like Revelation 16:12, in which the sixth of seven angels pours out a bowl of Yahweh's wrath into the Euphrates River, which causes it to dry up and make way for kings from the east to invade and conquer the land. It's a sign of the apocalypse, and when it comes to pass, the end of the world is at hand. Only that verse isn't speaking of the Euphrates River or the kingdom of Babylon. It's the hope of Yahweh's judgment coming to Rome during the early Christian period, and it's borrowed from older passages used in reference to Babylon, Egypt, and Assyria. And none of those passages predicted the future. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. If you're reading from the Christian Old Testament, then what follows Ezekiel would be the book of Daniel. But if you're reading from the Hebrew Bible, you'll find Hosea and Joel following Ezekiel, and the book of Daniel will be near the end of the book, preceding only Ezra and Nehemiah and the two books of Chronicles. For our study, we'll follow the order of the Hebrew Bible and pick up with Hosea and Joel today, and save Daniel for another time. Hosea and Joel are two books of the minor prophets, 12 short prophetic writings attributed to Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Hosea is set in the final days of King Jeroboam II, who reigned in the northern kingdom of Israel until 747 BCE. He's notable as the last long-reigning king of that nation. After his 40-year reign would come 6 kings spanning only 2 decades, with 4 of them falling to the assassin's blade before the nation itself would fall to the Assyrians and be no more. The nation of Israel would soon be paying tribute to foreign rulers and seeking alliances with past enemies in a future effort to retain autonomy in the face of the expanding Assyrian Empire, led by Tiglath-Pileser III. Apologies to Mr. Tiglath if I mispronounced your name. Please don't invade North Carolina and demand tribute from me if I didn't get it right. The primary concern of this book is the worship of Canaanite gods and the conflation of Yahweh with the storm god Baal. Don't worry, we'll definitely be digging deeper into that topic later in this episode. Though the setting is Israel before its fall to the Assyrians, the message is one of judgment and salvation, similar to other post-exilic works from centuries after the events portrayed in the book of Hosea. As for the actual dating of this piece, opinions vary. More conservative theologians place them in the period the book portrays, around 750 BCE, and see it as a true prophecy that foretells the eventual downfall of Israel decades after the writing was first penned. More critical scholars, however, place it firmly in the post-exilic period, and the book of Hosea is merely set in the final days of Israel, but is actually about the end of the southern kingdom of Judah, and the message of restoration is meant for those who have settled in the land around Jerusalem, following the fall of Babylon at the hands of the Persians. And of course, some scholars split the difference, placing its compilation in the post-exilic period, but some of its composition in the time of Jeroboam II. In my personal opinion, and this is just my opinion, it has too much in common with post-exilic material, and I side with the majority of serious scholars who place the writing after the mid-6th century BCE in the Persian period. This falls in line with 2 other topics of concern within the book, an objection to sacrificial rituals and of the political instability. Both of these were featured in post-exilic material. The book begins with symbolism of the sins of the nation of Israel. Hosea, a stand-in for the kingdom, will embrace prostitution, a common allegory for idolatry in the prophetic material. Some argue that this means Hosea is to marry a prostitute, while others argue he marries a woman who then engages in prostitution. Since this is allegorical for the crimes of the nation, the order of events doesn't actually matter. The point of the matter is that Israel has turned from Yahweh and engaged in idolatry. A third possibility is that Gomer became a prostitute and was then brought back to her husband. This is supported by the beginning of chapter 3 and better fits the message of judgment and restoration, but we'll get into that in a moment. Hosea is instructed by Yahweh to marry a prostitute, and she bears children for him. The first is to be named Jezreel, meaning God will sow. A grim portent for the nation, as we've already seen how God reaps and how judgment is linked with the harvest. If you haven't guessed by now, the names of Hosea's children symbolize the fate of the nation, the result of their embracing of idolatry. Yahweh threatens to break the nation, indicating this was written well after the events transpired, not decades before them. Then Gomer, the prostitute/wife, bears a daughter whom Yahweh decides must be Lo Ruhama, meaning not pitied, as he will have no pity on the nation as they suffer his wrath. Some years later she bore another son, this one named Lo Amai, meaning not my people. The opening chapter ends with, "For you are not my people, and I am not I am for you." This is a reference to I am who I am from Exodus 3:14. And this ending of the relationship with the people of Israel is a reversal of the relationship that began with the covenant in Exodus 6:7, when Yahweh decides the people will belong to him. The opening of chapter 2 references this reversal of the covenant, but offers hope for a second reversal. Instead of being called, "You are not my people," the Israelites will be called children of the living God. Not only is this a promise of hope, but the reference to Yahweh as a living God is to contrast him with the empty idols that Israel has turned to. The chapter continues as a poem which portrays Israel as the spouse of Yahweh. Yahweh has disowned his wife until she decides to abandon her role as a prostitute. He will strip her naked as he found her on the day of her birth, symbolic of the desolation of the land that followed the deportation of the populace at the hands of the Assyrians. These children of Israel are considered to be guilty by association, as they are children begotten of prostitution. She may seek help from her lovers, but it'll be fruitless, meaning that political alliances with neighboring countries will not prevent their downfall. The text then turns to the act of offering sacrifices, claiming they were not sent to Yahweh, but to Baal. Because of this, Yahweh threatens to remove the riches from the land. We covered this before. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been drifting toward monotheism prior to their downfall. The idea of worshiping Yahweh to the exclusion of the other gods was a concept that the refugees brought to the southern kingdom of Judah following the Assyrian conquest of Israel. So their worship wasn't some kind of theological backsliding in which they turned from Yahweh to worship some pagan gods. Rather, this is an accusation that the cause of their downfall was the practice of worship associated with pre-exilic religion. And the god they worshipped, Yahweh, is here being equated with Baal to symbolize that older style of worship. And as we'll soon see, this wasn't the worship of a different god, but simply referring to the same God by his older name. Because Israel has refused to acknowledge where her blessings came from, Yahweh will remove those blessings. Because she pursues her lovers, Yahweh will thwart her search. Because the nation doesn't worship properly, Yahweh will end worship altogether, as we see in verses 12 to 13, as he puts an end to all religious festivals, new moon celebrations, Sabbaths, and seasonal feasts. Because of the sacrifices made to other gods, she will be punished. But there is hope, presented in the end of the chapter as a new day arrives. And on that day, when the people turn from their old worship and toward Yahweh, he will make a new covenant with them. They will be rewarded with safety following their new betrothal to Yahweh. Just as Yahweh responded to past transgressions of Israel, he does so here as well. When Israel forgets their God and covenant, Yahweh causes the nation to remember. The chapter concludes with the patron deity stating that they are his people, and they accept him as their God. But perhaps the most interesting detail in this chapter comes in verse 18, when Yahweh says, "On that day you shall call me my husband, and you shall never again call me Baal." Whoops. It looks like the author seems to have acknowledged a name change for the ancient Canaanite deity. Now, this isn't to say that Yahweh and Baal are simply one god. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But make no mistake, Baal was renamed and became Yahweh. Let me explain. Worship of Yahweh seems to have begun in the southern regions, with the Midianites and surrounding people. Eventually, this spread to the north, and the god Yahweh, who already bore similarities with Baal, became merged with him. In one document discovered in Ugarit, the father god El rewards Baal with a new honorific title. The name Baal already meant Lord, but he's now elevated higher in the pantheon to the Lord of Lords with his new title, which likewise meant Lord, but in a stronger sense. The new title of Yah, one of the many names for Yahweh. Even then, there wasn't only a single Yahweh, but several. Deities were often local, and we see references to some of these variations of Yahweh in the Bible, such as Yahweh of Samaria, Yahweh of Edom, and Yahweh of Jerusalem. Eventually, even these would be merged together, and all the various Yahwehs would be considered to be a single God, as we see in Deuteronomy 6:4. And a larger part of this monolithic deity is comprised of the Canaanite god Baal. And this isn't even the first time that the Hebrew Bible conflates Yahweh with Baal. In 2 Samuel 5:20 and 1 Chronicles 14:11, the Israelites find victory at a river crossing, where Yahweh helps them to break through the enemy forces. The river crossing is then named for that victory, and the text states that it is named for Yahweh's victory there, a name which means Yahweh breaks through. But the name given for the river crossing is Baal Perazim, meaning Baal breaks through. So the author again conflates the two deities, stating that Baal and Yahweh are two names for a single god, or at least they were at the time of those writings. So when we see castigations against worship of Baal, those aren't the author chastising people for paganism, but for following old styles of worship which have now fallen out of fashion. Just as they were once offering human sacrifices to Yahweh, but later such practices were considered taboo. Baal is the name for Yahweh's old identity and associated with the old form of Yahwism. Yahweh is the name they should use exclusively for the deity in the post-exilic period, and the old styles of Yahwism should be abandoned. In the opening lines of chapter 3, Yahweh again orders Hosea to unite with a woman, this time one who is already married and commits adultery. We are not told if this is Gomer, the prostitute from chapter 1, or another woman, and we're also not told if her sin of adultery is one she's already committed, or if Hosea is the man she is cheating with. And again, it doesn't matter. The point is this woman represents those who cheat on Yahweh with other gods. And as we learn at the end of verse 1, specifically the worship of Asherah, the Canaanite fertility goddess and wife of Baal and Yahweh. Yahweh commands that she wait for her husband, and during her time of waiting, she has no kings or princes, makes no sacrifices, and has no sacred pillars, possesses no ephods or household gods. This is the state that the Judahites found themselves in while living in exile. If, during this trying time, they turn to Yahweh, then he will welcome them back, and the nation will once again be his bride. This can be read one of two ways. First, it could expound on the oracle in chapter 1, and this is the prostitute Gomer. Or this could be a second oracle which uses a similar theme and isn't meant to be read in conjunction with the first chapter at all. Chapter 4 begins the second section of Hosea, which elaborates on the themes presented in the first 3 chapters, that of guilt, punishment, and restoration of Israel. And of course, this isn't about Israel at all, but about Judah and the exiles settling there. So don't read chapter 4 as a continuation of the first 3 chapters. Instead, read the first 3 chapters as a sort of allegorical synopsis of chapters 4 through 14. One particular deviation from this theme is the complete lack of reference to Israel as the unfaithful wife. These chapters refer to Israel in the masculine form, not the feminine. The section begins with an indictment of the nation of Israel and its people. Yahweh takes issue with the inhabitants of the land, something we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah. Their sins are listed as failing to acknowledge God, swearing, lying, murder, theft, and adultery. Their actions cause desolation of the land and widespread drought. Even the animals of the land, air, and sea all suffer because of the sins of the people, as Yahweh vents his wrath on the entire nation, undoing creation to a chaotic state, as we found in the beginning of Genesis. He then turns his attention to the priests who led the people astray, a common complaint against the Jerusalem temple priests. The priests are here referred to in the singular, one monolithic priest who represents all of the corrupt priests and prophets. They have ruined the people through their lack of knowledge and rejected Yahweh, so their God has rejected them, and they can no longer serve as his priests. Glory is turned into shame, and their sins multiplied along with their population. You'll notice here a parallel with the Book of Watchers, as the priests are represented by the fallen angels, who spread forbidden knowledge over the earth, and the resulting population is corrupted with sin and must be destroyed. When we realize these prophecies are written in the centuries immediately prior to the Book of Enoch, we can see how these ideas became foundational to that mythology. These false priests offered sacrifices on mountaintops and beneath poplar and terebinth trees, which were 2 common practices in older forms of Yahwism. The text goes on to equate their idolatry with prostitution, and then condemns the people for offering sacrifices with the women of the temple. In later times, only men served as priests, but apparently this wasn't always the case. Priestesses were common in ancient worship, especially when goddesses were the object of worship, and we know the ancient Israelites had female deities within their pantheon. The chapter ends with a proclamation of judgment against the people. A wind has bound them up in his wings. They shall be ashamed because of their altars. Compare this with Malachi 4:2, when a winged sun appears. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will raise with healing in his wings. This formulaic phrase, which links the embrace by a winged deity with judgment, is of particular interest, and here's why. It does not say, in his wings. That is a deliberate mistranslation. Some versions render it in its wings, with a footnote that mentions how the pronoun is ambiguous, but it isn't. It's a feminine pronoun. The same phrase appears in both verses, and both read, in her wings. This deity, represented as the sun, is a goddess, and it is almost certainly Asherah, the Queen of Heaven. One final detail in chapter 4 before moving on. The author condemns the use of hilltop shrines and sacred groves, which was a common objection after worship had been centralized in the Jerusalem temple. But there is also a condemnation of the use of the oath, "as Yahweh lives." Declaring that Yahweh lives as part of an oath or an exclamation has appeared before, such as in Jeremiah 23:8, 2 Kings 2:2, and Psalm 18:46. It was a common oath, and variants of it appear in songs. So what was so upsetting to this author about the use of this oath, which had once been so acceptable? Given the context, it's apparent that older styles of worship and older ideas of their deity have something to do with it, as he is likewise upset concerning the mentions of Baal and Asherah. So what's upsetting about Yahweh being alive? I think it's because, like Baal, he was a dying and rising god before the reforms, and that portion of his story had been expunged. No longer was Yahweh a god who died, so the exclamation, "Yahweh lives," uttered at his resurrection is now a reminder of that older mythology that the reformers are trying so desperately to remove. There are other hints that Yahweh was once a resurrected deity, But that's a topic for another episode. Yahweh then moves to an accusation of three figures: the priests, the house of Israel, and the king. Here he serves as judge, prosecutor, and accuser. They have set snares, practice prostitution, bear illegitimate children, and stumble because of their sins. The timeline then jumps ahead almost 2 decades to the Syro-Ephraimite War. Ephraim is to become barren, and Judah is rotten. The great king of Assyria has come to destroy. Likewise, Yahweh rides alongside the Assyrian army bent on destruction, and what he destroys, no one can restore. Finally, at the closing of chapter 5, Yahweh stalks off like a lion with a fresh kill to await the day when his people will turn back to him and seek his protection. It's a bit morbid, inflicting death and destruction in the hopes that they'll beg his assistance and protection, painfully aware that it's their own deity they need protection from. But this also gives us a glimpse into the minds of these writers and the complex psychology at work behind the biblical text and the perpetual victimhood of the people who live in this ancient crossroads of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Chapter 6 continues the theme of Yahweh as a hunting lion, tearing the flesh of Israel, and how the people now wish him to heal their wounds. He has struck them down, but might now bind their wounds, and on the third day he will raise them up. Here they are envisioning their own resurrection in the same time frame that Yahweh and so many other ancient gods experienced, rising on the third day after their deaths. In the Christian literature, Jesus, serving as a stand-in for both Yahweh and the Israelites, will likewise return on the third day. This, like the rising of Jesus centuries later, serves to inspire the sinners to repent and strive to follow Yahweh, who comes to them like a spring rain to replenish the earth, treating us with more storm god imagery that we've come to expect from a deity who incorporates so many details of Baal into his persona. But their veneration must be sincere, or they risk further punishment for the crime of betraying Yahweh's covenant, which they broke at the place of Adam. This town is mentioned only one other time in the Bible, in Joshua 3:16, where the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River occurred immediately prior to the siege of Jericho. The water stopped flowing, according to the story, near a town called Adam. And this mention of the breaking of a covenant at this town is a reference to some lost part of their theology. The chapter ends with a threat of a harvest to come to Israel and Judah, another term for Yahweh's judgment and wrath. Yahweh then decides to heal Israel from the punishment brought on by its guilt, only to discover more wickedness from Samaria. They preach falsehood at the temple there, spreading lies that harm the people like thieves and bandits. Now they're surrounded by their crimes and doomed to further punishment. To make matters worse, the political institutions are just as corrupt as their temple practices. Kings and princes deal in treachery, poisoning themselves with sin. Their corruption is spoken of in terms of smoldering ovens, which threaten to ignite, warning of the dangers of both internal conspiracies and of open violence. The imagery of a baker's oven from the oracle against internal politics is continued in the oracle against their foreign politics, as the bread is mixed with impure ingredients, symbolizing the mixing of religious practices from neighboring nations. This loss of national identity causes Israel to be like half-baked bread, just as in the previous chapter, when Yahweh the Destroyer became their hope for salvation. Now the idea is reversed. Where once he was their aid, now he is their doom. The nation has rebelled against its deity, and now death by the sword awaits them. The following chapters is in many ways a repeat of chapter 7, a condemnation of domestic and foreign politics, as well as the temple cult. It begins with the threat of military invasion, as the prophet blows the horn to signify the beginning of battle. The people cry out that they follow Yahweh, but the blatant idolatry led by their own king puts the lie to their words and enkindles Yahweh's wrath. The idol in question is a golden calf in Samaria, a cultic icon of Yahweh that had stood for centuries but is no longer welcome in their Reformed religion, which has cast off physical representations of their patron god. We return to harvest imagery of judgment accompanied by storm god imagery of wrath, as the people sow futility and reap the whirlwind. The nation is swallowed up by their neighbors. Their dispersal into foreign lands is understood to be like going down into Sheol to be forgotten. Their altars, created for the expiation of sin, have now become altars of sinning, and the laws given to them by Yahweh are ignored. They make sacrifices, but even those are rejected as their patron god focuses instead on their guilt. For this, they shall be driven down into Egypt as destruction is visited upon the cities of Israel and Judah. Celebration in Israel is set aside as they experience days of punishment for abandoning their God. They attributed the fertility of the land to gods worshipped at the threshing floor, an allusion to the harvest festivals in honor of Baal and of Yahweh. Their sacrifices and libations will no longer please him, and even the bread of the presence will be ritually unclean and no longer be fit for consumption. Hosea warns of ignoring his messages as he chastises those who would mock him, claiming the people called him a mad fool, but his words were a dire warning of a coming wrath that soon materialized. Of course, passages like these are placed within a text to be regurgitated by later prophets when anyone doubts their words. Remember, the purpose of prophetic writing isn't to foretell the future, but to inspire change in the present. The attention then turns to their past as Yahweh says the nation was once like ripe grapes and figs, the first fruits of the harvest set aside for God, but now they're forgotten and consecrated instead to the shameful one, an epithet for Baal. They even engage in child sacrifice, a topic that we touched on in the Isaiah material. See episode 83 for the practice of human sacrifice to Yahweh in the nation of Israel. Once again, the practices which once appeased Yahweh are now condemned as being practices to a foreign god. Because of their sins, Yahweh will remove the fertility of the land and of the people, causing women to suffer miscarriages and the people driven from their homes. Even if the women somehow do bear children, Yahweh will murder them in his anger. Chapter 10 can be divided into two sections. The first, in verses 1 through 8, deals with the destruction of cultic objects in Israel. The accusation of idolatry is levied against the northern kingdom. The more Yahweh bestows gifts on the nations, the more they turn from him and place their faith in foreign gods, erecting Asherah poles and altars outside of the central temple. Their treachery is their own downfall, its corruption manifesting in false accusations and civil lawsuits that sprout up like weeds in a field. They pray to the golden calf which we first saw in the Exodus story. It will be carried off to Assyria when they conquer the land. Israel and its kings will fade away. Punishment for their wicked schemes and their hilltop shrines and altars will be abandoned. They'll be overgrown with vines as they fall into disuse. Beginning in verse 9, we come to the second half of the chapter that speaks of the great war that will serve as Israel's punishment for its wickedness. The people of the land are perverse and will be made to suffer hardships as punishment. Like beasts of burden, Israel and Judah shall be yoked and forced to plow the fields, serving as vassal states for foreign empires. War shall erupt in the land, and the mighty fortresses of Israel will fall. Mothers and children alike will be smashed against the rocks, and when the sun rises, it will do so over a nation with no king. This is a classic reversal of the expected. As we've seen before, in religious ceremonies, the divine king would march into the city at dawn to symbolize the rising sun and its associated deity. This was a victorious moment, as he symbolically conquered the darkness and chaos. So dawn represented the arrival of the God-King and victory of the nation and the temple cult. Now it represents destruction and desolation, ruination of the cult, and reveals the absence of the king. This is the same as a cleansing flood. The purpose is to return the world to a state of pre-creation. Everything which has been made has now been unmade. Order, now corrupted, has been overturned and the land brought to chaos. This is Yahweh's method for correcting problems, as seen in the Noah story. Destroy it all and start over. And all of this is done to show that their golden calf is simply a man-made idol, and no substitute for their true king, which is Yahweh. While chapter 10 is about punishment and destruction, chapter 11 focuses on salvation. It begins with Yahweh as a disappointed parent who tries teaching Israel to walk and feeding the nation like an infant. Despite his care, the nation continues to rebel, offering sacrifice to Canaanite gods and burning incense to idols. As the nation insists on chasing after other gods, Yahweh decides that Assyria can be their new king, and Egypt can be their new home. War can ravage their cities as punishment for their apostasy. But the love of their patron god is stronger than his rage, and Yahweh turns back toward his people. And his heart swells with pity for the nation, and he decides to restore the nation to its former glory. Still, his gentle side has little depth, as his call for their return isn't one of kindness, indicative of an open arms welcome. Instead, he roars like a lion, and his terrified children approach out of fear for further punishment, and settle in the land, trembling like fragile birds. This isn't a caring God being portrayed in these verses, but a raging and abusive father compelling small and frightened children to obey through the threat of violence. Even in salvation, he is a beast which must be feared. Something of note in these passages is found in verses 8 through 9, as Yahweh is seen arguing with himself concerning the fate of the nation. Should he continue to punish them and vent his wrath, or should he show compassion? This isn't an omniscient deity, but an anthropomorphic one who's more akin to the gods of Olympus than the transcendent force of nature often imagined in the modern world. The next section concerns the infidelity of Israel, and it may begin in Hosea chapter 12 or at the end of chapter 11, depending on which version of the Bible you're using. Israel is plagued with lies, and Judah consorts with false gods, remaining faithful to the lesser gods within the pantheon. This may be presented in terms like Judah is faithful to the holy ones, which are lesser subordinate gods within the divine council. We saw them mentioned in the Job story. Later, these will be reclassified as angels as theologians attempt to tidy up the heavens and reduce the number of gods to just one. Israel seeks alliances with Egypt and Assyria, making a covenant with foreign nations while abandoning their covenant with Yahweh. For this, the nation has earned its punishment. The nation was fathered by Jacob, a man who supplanted his brother while still in the womb, and wrestled with God beside the Jabbok River, and won. These are references to scenes from Genesis 25 and 27. Yahweh now demands his loyalty, but he has turned away, seeking wealth earned through false scales like a corrupt merchant. But Yahweh has brought them out of exile from Egypt through the words of his prophet. What's interesting here is that their exile begins with their defeat at the hands of the Assyrians when they were punished for idolatry, and then they are brought out of Egypt at the time of their restoration once their punishment has ended. So the time in Egypt seems to be set near the end of the 700s BCE and lasts until the end of Judah's exile in Babylon, about 2 centuries later, not 500 years prior during the time of Ramses II. The nation is then threatened with what amounts to homelessness, as their dwellings will be destroyed and they'll be forced to live in tents. This is a reference to the Feast of Booths, as tents are erected near fields, and residents of the city would live there to be closer to the work during the time of the harvest. It's become a ritual celebration. Later, the Exodus story was used as an ideological tale for the origin of this practice. Here, the people are punished with living in tents as a nod to this ancient pagan practice. This will serve as a new etiology for the Festival of Booths. Chapter 13 speaks of the death of Israel in terms of the death of Ephraim, Jacob's grandson and the progenitor of the Ephraimite tribe. He enjoyed an honored position in Israel, but consorted with Canaanite gods. His descendants continued his paganism, crafting silver idols and worshipping golden calves. This betrayal of Yahweh, who claimed this people as his own, has invited his wrath. He commanded they worship only he, as they shall have no Savior but Yahweh. Since they have failed in this, he will scatter them like chaff in the wind and tear out their hearts like a bear. They'll be devoured and ripped apart as he hunts them. He proclaims, I will destroy you, O Israel. Who is there to help you? Where is your king that he may rescue you? He has taken away their king, and in his wrath he shall inflict pain upon the nation. The chapter ends with Yahweh asking himself if he should deliver the nation from Sheol, or let it dry up and wither. Like previous chapters, the closing chapter of Hosea levies the charge of rebellion against the northern kingdom of Israel. Yahweh's punishment is brutal, condemning the adult populace to die by the sword, while their infants are dashed to pieces. Pregnant women will be ripped open so that their unborn children can be killed according to the will of Yahweh. Once this destruction has been visited upon the people, they'll have an opportunity to return to their God, abandoning their apostasy and the worship of their idols. If they do, the nation will grow tall like a cedar and blossom like a fruitful vine. The book ends by asking who is wise enough to understand these words and walk the straight paths set before them by Yahweh. Next up is the book of Joel, though pamphlet may be more apt, as the text is a mere 4 chapters, or 3 chapters depending on which Bible you're currently reading. Not that your copy is missing a chapter. It isn't. It's just that some versions consider the last third of Joel to be chapters 3 and 4, while other versions just lump them all together and call it chapter 3. So the pamphlet of Joel is as follows. Chapter 1, the announcement of unprecedented disaster. Chapter 2, the day of the Lord. And finally, Chapter 3, Yahweh's final judgment, which may or may not be divided into 2 parts. However, some Bibles split it up differently still. Chapter 2, verses 28 to 32 are sometimes split from the rest of Chapter 2 and regarded as Chapter 3, while the old Chapter 3 is then renamed Chapter 4. So, who is Joel? According to the opening line of the book, he's the son of Pethuel. That's it. That's all we know about the man because his name appears only once in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, and that's in the opening line of this book, which claims that what follows is the word of Yahweh. Of course, this line is written in the third person, so obviously it wasn't written by Joel himself. Now, this isn't to say that he's the only Joel in the Bible. He certainly isn't. There are indeed other Joels, but those are all different people. Joel, son of Pethuel, appears only in Joel chapter 1, verse 1. There isn't much in the book which can be used to assign a definite date, so some conservative theologians attempt to place the writing of Joel in the 9th century BCE. Unfortunately for them, there are vague mentions of the exile of the Judeans, and he mentions the temple which is currently standing, placing him firmly in the Second Temple period. There's no reference to the king, even where such mentions should appear, like in the middle of chapter 2. But the temple cult is currently practicing, so it's obviously after the exile. Because of this and other evidence, many scholars assign the composition of the text to the 3rd century BCE, though it might be as early as the 5th century BCE. As for the man himself, as noted before, this book probably wasn't written by the prophet himself. Like many other prophetic works, it was probably written centuries after the prophet had died and falsely attributed to him. The audience would have known who this Joel was supposed to be, but that identity seems to have been lost to history. And of course, there's the possibility that Joel never actually existed, but was a legendary character associated with the consecration of the Second Temple, who was then retrojected back in time to the time of Solomon to serve the same purpose. And his name is of no help to us, as it's simply a combination of the names Yahweh and El. So it means that Yahweh and El are one God, or that Joel is one who firmly believes them to be, or Yahweh is God, since El can be a proper name or a generic term for a deity. As we've seen in the post-exilic prophetic material, these guys love their biblical plagues, and Joel is no exception. In fact, the first two-thirds of his entire book is concerned with a locust plague. Apparently, when Yahweh arrives, he brings the bugs. We can't narrow this down to any specific plague of locusts since we don't even know in what century this author lived, but that's not the point. The locust plague is symbolic of Yahweh's wrath, so it shouldn't be read as a reference to any single historical event. Just like the flood imagery used in other prophetic works wasn't talking about an actual flood in Judah, but an invading army from Babylon. Another detail of note concerning Joel is that the book is presented in a similar style as a lament psalm, describing the plight of the populace and the effects of the problem. It includes a plea to Yahweh to spare the people from their suffering and an expression of repentance to sway his opinion, as well as leveraging Yahweh's own pride, stating that his reputation will be at stake if his people perish. Finally, it includes the response from Yahweh as he relents and the celebration of the people in light of their salvation. He begins by exclaiming, "Listen, elders, pay attention, all who dwell in the land. Has anything such as this ever happened in your lifetime or in the lifetime of your ancestors? Report it to your children and their children." He then goes on to describe how the locusts devoured all the crops that were left behind after the harvest. This exact imagery has been used before in regards to the invading armies of the Assyrians and Babylonians, who swept up the populace, leaving none behind. They consume and devour, and of course, we learn in verse 6 that we're actually talking about an invading army, as the text specifically states that. A nation invaded the land, and this army was beyond counting. The land is stripped bare, and people wail in mourning. Religious offerings in the temple are cut off, and devastation is nationwide. The people lament, dressed in sackcloth, and resort to fasting in light of the scarcity of food. And this is seen as a punishment from the Almighty. Granaries are destroyed and storehouses are emptied. Even the herd animals are confused as the grass has been consumed. The trees are all burned away and the rivers all run dry. This imagery, the drying up of rivers, is typical of the Day of Judgment, as we've already seen in Isaiah 19:5 and 44:27, along with Jeremiah 50:38 and Ezekiel 30:12. This will appear again in Revelation 16:12 in reference to Rome, though the author calls the city Babylon to avoid being nailed to a tree, as the Romans were fond of doing. As the day of the Lord approaches in chapter 2, the prophet commands the horn of Zion to be blown, alerting those on the holy mountain and the inhabitants of the land of the coming danger. This is our Ezekiel as a watchman theme that we saw in previous episodes. Just as we've seen before, the presence of Yahweh is depicted as a cloud of smoke and a rising sun, though the arrival of Yahweh isn't a sign of victory, but one of destruction and devouring flames. Judah was like the Garden of Eden, but after Yahweh's wrath it is dead and desolate. The locusts appear like thundering chariots and assemble like an invading army. They enter like thieves, sneaking in through windows, and move in such large number that they shake the earth. The sun, moon, and stars are all darkened, and Yahweh himself leads this invading army. He rides at the head, great and terrifying, and none can survive him. Halfway through chapter 2, Yahweh instructs the audience to return to him with their whole heart, because he is gracious and merciful, which is a bit odd considering this is juxtaposed with the threat to lay waste to the land and leave no survivors. The horn of Zion is blown again, this time to proclaim a fast and gather the people for consecration. The priests weep at the altar of the temple, begging Yahweh to spare their lives and reminding Yahweh that other nations will ask where his people have gone if he kills them all. So Yahweh relents in his killing and promises to never again make them a disgrace among the nations. The invaders will be removed from their land, and the people proclaim that Yahweh has done great things, and the fate of the people and their land has been reversed. The people flourish and the trees grow fruit. Rather than mourn, they celebrate and rejoice. And just as Job was rewarded with more than what Yahweh took, Judah is given double what the locusts have eaten. The chapter ends by rhetorically asking what other God has acted so wondrously. One quick note before moving on from chapter 2 is that Yahweh twice promises an early rain in verse 23. This is not only another reference to the familiar weather god imagery we've seen so often before, but the word for the early rain is nearly identical for that of teacher. Later writers will link this with the teacher of righteousness in the Qumran text. This idea of linking a holy teacher with heaven-sent rain already existed as early as the writing of 1 Kings, where it appears in chapter 8, verse 36. The next section is the Day of the Lord, which might be considered chapter 2, verses 28 to 32, or it might be its own chapter listed as chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. This is a separate oracle, which has no mention of the locust plague from the previous 2 chapters. It begins with Yahweh proclaiming his intention to pour out his Spirit on all of the people and the land, and the young and old will give prophecy and experience dreams and visions. Even the slaves will benefit from Yahweh's Spirit. Signs will be seen in the heavens and on earth, signs of blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will go dark and the moon will turn red before the arrival of Yahweh. These are recognized as not only signs of the end times in Revelation, but also as the plagues of Egypt. Those who call upon the name of Yahweh will escape harm, another detail in common with Exodus and Revelation, and a remnant of the people will dwell in Zion. This short chapter will become important to later Christians as it's quoted in Acts 2:17-21 and popular among those who fear the end times for obvious reasons. It outlines judgment, wrath, signs of wonder, and restoration for the chosen people, all in 5 short verses. And the closing verse, which begins, "All who call upon the name of the Lord will escape harm," is quoted in Romans 10:13, in justification of Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Following this is Yahweh's case against the nations, which may be listed as the beginning of chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 3, or chapter 4, verse 6, depending on where your Bible decided to place the Day of the Lord section. It begins with, "In those days when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all of the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat." This is the valley where Yahweh judges. He sits on his throne on Zion above the valley and judges the enemies of his land for the crime of scattering his people. These enemies include Tyre, Sidon, and Philistia. Part of their punishment will be to sell their children into slavery to the Judahites, giving us another endorsement of chattel slavery by Yahweh. In verse 9, Yahweh proclaims a holy war. All of the soldiers gather to march, turning plowshares into swords, pruning knives into spears, and following Yahweh into battle. Their enemies are likened to grapes harvested and placed in the winepress, crushed until their blood overflows the vats. As in previous oracles, the sun, moon, and stars are darkened, and Yahweh roars from his seat on Zion, and the earth quakes. The theme then turns to the restoration of the people to their land. They are assured they'll never again have to travel and be strangers in foreign lands. The streams in Judah, which have gone dry, now run with fresh water. Along with their restoration is the destruction of Egypt and Edom. Finally, their guilt is forgiven as Yahweh promises to dwell in Zion forever. The themes of land restoration, avenging their losses by inflicting harm on foreign nations, and eternal inhabitation are familiar by this point and need no reiteration. It's the secure future that is hoped for by those who endured an uncertain past. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.